series. Before we go ahead, I request you, in case you have still not muted your microphones, kindly mute your microphones. The title for today's lecture is Supply Chain Super-Adaptiveness, Case Study of a Pharmaceutical Company's Response to H1N1 Influenza Pandemic. The webinar is being presented by Professor ManMohan Sodhi. Before we begin, I would like to give a brief introduction about Professor Sodhi. Professor Sodhi is currently a professor at CAPS Business School at City University, London. Prior to joining CAPS Business School in August 2002, Professor Sodhi was vice president at a software company based in San Jose. He worked as a director for enterprise e-business strategy at Scient, and prior to that was a manager in the supply chain practice at Accenture. He has worked with clients in a variety of industries, including consumer electronics, commodity and specialty chemicals, petroleum product distribution, hospitality industry procurement, and airlines. Professor Sodhi received his PhD in management science from the Anderson Graduate School of Management at UCLA in 1994. Subsequently, he taught operations management at the Ross School at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, where his research in the trucking industry was funded by Sloan Foundation. Once again, I request all of you to kindly ensure that your microphones are muted during the webinar. Kindly send your question via the chat window. Clarifications can be asked during the presentations, while questions requiring discussion and debate or providing your point of view will be taken at the end of the webinar. Without adding any more matter and wasting any more time, I request Professor Sodhi to go ahead with the webinar. Over to you, Professor Sodhi.
Okay, thanks, Chitresh. Yes, please keep an eye on the chat. Any clarification questions, just feel free to interrupt me. So some of you may have noticed that we have a pandemic going on, and hence this seminar series. So I'll talk about my own experience via case study during the swine flu from 2009-2010. And I see a lot of similarities. I'm amazed how much we have forgotten about pandemics. I mean, that was only 10 years ago. And I still remember the headlines, and I don't know if anybody else does, at least in London, that hundreds of thousands of Britons expected to die. I mean, this is how the newspaper opening headlines were at that time. So it's not that we've never been through a pandemic before. So what I want to do is, as we go through this particular pandemic and companies need to respond, what is it that we can take away from the previous pandemic? And I was very lucky to be embedded in a company at that time where we were doing a case study, and that's when the pandemic hit. So we could track over time what they did, and then over time learn what a company needs to be. So, okay, that's the background. So businesses today face lots of uncertainties. I mean, not just businesses, even us as individuals. When will this lockdown be over? I'm sure that's a question, at least for most of us, unless you're in Sweden. And will there be a second lockdown or a third lockdown? Some governments are already talking as if we should just have one long lockdown so that we don't have a second lockdown. But at least looking at previous pandemic, the next peak might come 4 months from now. So you don't want a lockdown that is 5 months long or 6 months long. Anyway, there is question of vaccines and antivirals, and every day we get contradictory information. And because we are getting contradictory information, there is question whether these will work or not. And that again makes this question, would the lockdown be over or not? Or when would it be over? And then there's a lot of talk of government support and whether, what shape it'll come and whether it'll come or not. And then there is this question of recovery being V-shaped, W-shaped, L-shaped. Certainly the stock markets indicate that nothing is wrong, which is kind of strange when you look at real life. But anyway, the stock market believes it's a V-shaped recovery, and we should actually already have recovered. But it could be W-shaped, meaning stock, especially with two peaks. So stock market goes up, goes down again, and goes back up. Or it could be L-shaped, where the economic recovery doesn't happen or doesn't happen for a long time. So either way, these are things we don't know now. Oh, by the way, and then there is this thing of companies having to do the right thing and say, okay, what if we start making some personal protection equipment or ventilators or something? And you've heard stories how different companies are making their own particular designs of these things, but that's not their core business. And obviously, if the pandemic keeps spreading, that might become a core business for many companies. So anyway, lots of uncertainties. And besides the uncertainties, there are secondary risks. There's the health of employees currently, and after lockdown, how many are you going to get back? There are demand-related risks because the demand may not pick up, or demand picks up but goes for totally different products, or goes for totally different same products, but the purchase habits have completely changed. Meaning, instead of retail stores, people are buying online. I mean, I'm just like you are already doing. um, so it's these demand is also very hard to predict, and forget just demand, even the retail channels are hard to predict. How would you sell your product? And then there are supply related risks. Your country might remove the lockdown and you can start producing, but your supplier is in a country where they can't send any goods, or they're in a country that removed lockdown early, but they already contracted out capacity to other people, and so you suddenly you are out of supplies. Or there can be the links in between, transportation links that are broken or disrupted, because so there are these secondary disruptions as well. So what should companies do? um, Knowing, if you were looking ahead at this extreme uncertainty, not knowing whether things are going up or going down, and whether you how you would go through these gyrations yourself. So one is stay home and do nothing, but we are already suffering under lockdown, and that's not much of an option for most companies. The second one is we become good at recovery or resilience. So we should be, but that would mean not just that we are able to increase production, recovery, but if it's a W-shaped recovery, then we should be able to cut down the production as well. So that's not something we study under resilience or even supply chain risk. Then, or are we talking about some kind of adaptation, scaling up, scaling down? After all, these are supposedly unprecedented times. My daughter and I have this game. We just count how many times people use the word unprecedented, although the precedence is only 10 years ago. um, we propose, by me, I don't just mean the royal we, but I have a co-author, Patrapa Chedist. She did her PhD at CAS. Anyway, so we are proposing that companies need to become super adaptable, and they need to make sure that their supply chains can support them being super adaptable. So that means being able to adapt, but not just adapt to this extreme ups and downs. So Howley has a paper in Harvard Business Review where he talks about the AAA supply chains. So these are supply chains competing with three characteristics: agility, adaptability, and alignment. Agility means they are able to meet their demand as the demand shifts. Adaptable means they're able to shift with the supply, and align means they're able to get all the actors in their supply chains aligned to the overall goal. So that's the definition of adaptability, adjusting the supply network to accommodate changes in the supplier market overall. And then recently, I and Chris have extended the idea of adaptability, which is really talking about profits, to extending that idea to profits, planet, people, so that the triple bottom line idea, saying what does adaptability, extended adaptability mean when we talk about the extended supply chain along with communities and the environment. So, but this talk is about what I call super adaptability. So this is the adaptability. So same as adaptability in the Howley sense, rather than extended adaptability. Uh, it's adaptability to adjust to extreme changes. So the original adaptability is adapting to changes. This one is really extreme changes. I mean, these are pandemics don't happen every other day, so the changes required are quite massive and quite permanent. So what we will do to understand, or what we did to understand super adaptability, is we reviewed our own study that we carried out in the previous pandemic, and that was the swine flu. So this was at a global top 4 pharma company. They had actually shut down their, so this is a major supplier for flu vaccine and flu antiviral. They had shut down their production in December 2008. As you know, it's in the autumn season, that's when flus happen. And they had decided, because the flu season was over, especially as far as they were concerned, they would shut down that production line and lay off the workers, basically save costs. So they shut down the API, the active ingredient. They shut down the secondary packaging lines, and they laid off the workers. And then this H1N1 flu started in March, initially as just a couple of cases in Mexico, and then a couple of cases in California. And then they had to restart everything very quickly, as I'll show you. So this is at least the UK experience of swine flu. So you can see there are 2 peaks. So whatever the recovery should have been W-shaped rather than V-shaped. I always smile because there is a big talk at my university whether the autumn term or fall term will be in-class teaching or online. I mean, it's not a decision under my control, but I would love to show them this slide. If COVID-19 is anything like the swine flu, it makes it very clear where the peak is. So in September, if you start classes, by November, you have the peak. So students will have gone back home long before then. And so you start with in-class and then it goes online again. So might as well just keep it online. Anyway, that's my way of thinking. That's based on this experience. But anyway, these are the new cases per week that the UK experienced. So going back to pharma, so essentially they had no production capacity for the active ingredient. They had no production capacity for secondary packaging. They had a few million doses in supply, but no workers. So the company does monitor flus worldwide. It is a major supplier. Haven't heard anything about them with this flu. So anyway, and the World Health Organization had actually declared the pandemic very quickly. If you look at the timeline on the right, you can understand what's going on. So March, Mexico reported a few cases. And then 21st April, California, next to Mexico, they had 2 cases. And it looked similar to H1N1, but also more dangerously, the 1918 Spanish flu. So the genome similarity was definitely there to 1918. Like the present virus, that one also had some combinations of 4 animals, and the 4th animal was the pig, and hence it's called swine flu. But the 3rd was birds, and the first 2 were whatever. So this whole family of viruses is very well connected with each other. So 21st April, we have the cases. 24th April, WHO declares regional epidemic. 25th April, the US government declares it a public health emergency. 27th April, WHO raises the threat from 3 to 4. And then just 2 days later, they raised the threat from 4 to 5. 5 means imminent pandemic. So that's really, it's not the same, but it's really almost the same as declaring a pandemic. This time with COVID-19, you know that it took a long time before WHO decided to declare it a pandemic, even though it was in many countries. Here we are only talking about Mexico and California at this point. But anyway, with this kind of speed occurring, so essentially what happened at on I think 29th or 30th April itself, this company got an order for 32 million doses of antiviral. So the assumption was that the current antiviral would work with this new pandemic as well, because the virus was very similar to H1N1. So now imagine you are in Pharma's situation. Uh, you have a bit in stock, but not much, 3 million doses. Uh, the order comes for 32 million doses. And the way the flu has gone, you know, this is just one country's orders, and there are something like 190 countries. So if orders start coming from all those countries, there is no way you can keep up with demand. Now you would say, oh, demand is optional, because what if I'm not able to meet the demand? I mean, this is nice to have that much demand, but unlike other sectors in pharma, if you have a life-saving product, you can't just tell the customers, oh, please go away, I'm too busy doing other things, because that's loss of reputation. So in a way, it is like a disruption where you've got this demand that you can't really say no to. And not only you've got this demand, you are now suddenly expecting much more demand, and you're not in a position to supply because you've shut down your capacity and you have no workers. So this is the research question about what is exactly is super-adaptability? What are the antecedents of super-adaptability? And the methodology, we used case study approach. It was a really grounded theory. Um, I won't talk much about it, but just qualitative case study. Theoretical lens, not exactly clear at this point how, but we approached it that there are resources. So typically, this particular company was competing with other companies. There were two other companies, if I remember correctly, who were also producing antiviral. So certainly you need to take a competition view and therefore resource-based view, but there's also the question of just surviving. And you can see today, COVID-19, two companies realizing that they just need to survive, out competing with each other as much as survival. But if you go through a V-shaped or a W-shaped recovery, eventually you are going to compete with other companies, or maybe it's just a question of who survives and how much they survive. So that's another, so these capabilities are another thing. So going to the back to the company situation. So pharma faced, by the way, I'm using the word pharma because they didn't authorize us to use the name, which was a huge challenge when it comes to publication, but can't help it. So three challenges. One was simply, so remember that timeline. We are really talking about going from April 25th to 29th. So in 4 days, in a way, the world changed completely for pharma. So there was complete uncertainty at that point. Some scientists published saying that this was going to be mild. Other scientists, and especially newspapers, saying, well, this will kill hundreds of thousands of people. Like at least I remember from my own experience here in London. Then WHO guidance was coming every day or every other day, and usually going from 3 to 4 or 4 to 5 is a matter of months for a regular flu. Here we are talking about 1 day, 2. So it was just very quick and with huge uncertainties. So with that kind of uncertainty, it's very hard to invest in new capacity, because what if the demand just goes away next day? You're not going to make a decision simply based on newspaper headlines. On the other hand, if you don't and people die, well, you are to blame because you didn't provide the medicine. And we are talking huge investments. Secondly, even if they said, okay, let's increase our capacity from 0 to 60 million, how will the supply channel and the distribution channels work? Will their capacity go up at the same time, at the same speed? So this is where you need, even if you can say, I'm super adaptable, if you don't have your supply chain behind you that is as super adaptable as you, then you're adaptable. The third question, of course, like for many global companies, is how to price it. I mean, right now in the newspapers, there was discussions about Gilead in the US pricing their remdesivir antiviral. And the early estimates were $4,500 for 1 week's dose per person. That's pretty amount of money. And of course, they have signed up with Indian manufacturers and Pakistani manufacturers and so on throughout the world, and will have different prices. But imagine if they were selling it for $100 in India, even that's quite a bit. But then between 100 and 4,500 is such a huge gap that you can imagine people start smuggling the drug uh, just because the price difference. But anyway, pricing is a challenge and the pandemic is global. So so anyway, despite this difficult situation, they did things quite well. They used their resources and capabilities. So overall, the death toll was around 300,000. And this was 15 times more than the hospital deaths. So hospital deaths were 18,000 world over. Actual deaths were about 300,000. So you start wondering, what do we really know about COVID-19 if you're just following data in the newspapers like me? But the Pharma did meet all the country's requirements for antiviral, and then in fall they were also able to make the vaccine and start distributing that. Unlike COVID-19, it did help that the similarities with H1N1 were quite high, so they could have uh, the antiviral and vaccine ready. So these were not new antivirals or new vaccines. So then their increased revenues, their response was noted by other global manufacturer. And then the virus was somewhat resistant to their two competitors' drugs. So in that sense, they got more kudos as being sort of better than their competitors. And of course, they developed capabilities for future pandemics. So we found in our that there were really four kinds of, we call them factors or antecedents based on our following the company during the pandemic. So I'll talk more in detail about being prepared, being able to reorganize for a crisis, being able to manage different stakeholders, including the press, and then be able to build and use resources. So these are sort of generic categories, and I'll get into details. So these are what I call as antecedents, and the consequences would be, or what super-adaptivity means in consequence, is being able to respond quickly. And the response is, how do you detect something has happened? How quickly can you design a solution? And how quickly can you deploy a solution? So this is something called 3D model. We have a short paper somewhere, but that's the 3D model of response. So the idea of super adaptivity is that we are able to respond quickly. So preparation means having, there's this, if you look at the categories on the left side, having monitoring systems in place. I mean, this company, flu is quite an important part of their revenue. So they do monitor globally if there's any flu occurring. They have good relations with the WHO, but they also have their own systems of monitoring flus. Every year, they run scenarios of what a flu may look like. So you may think, well, how come governments are not prepared? Well, governments are there for 4 years or 5 years, depending on the country. But companies, especially this one being around for decades, they know a pandemic will strike every 60 years or so on an average. Might happen sooner uh, than that. Um, and so every year they do a pandemic scenario analysis. They create pandemic scenarios, what it would look like, what would happen in case a pandemic strikes. So this is every year. So they are prepared when a pandemic comes. They stress test their supply chain, what would break. So you can see a lot of companies' supply chains are now completely broken. But this company, because they do stress testing every year on a regular basis, sometime in July, I think. So they know what a pandemic may look like. They may not know which pandemic is coming or when it would come, but whatever shape or form it comes, at least they have plans ready. So they have these what are called as pandemic plans for every site. They, I think at that time they had 82 sites around the world. So they have what's called a site preparedness plans, and they have it every year. These get revised. So when the pandemic struck in April, they had the pandemic plans from July, which needed to be updated because nobody had anticipated this particular form of the pandemic, but they had those ready, and then be able to draw on lessons from the past. So flus are there every day. Some years are worse than others. So it's the company does get experience each year, and so past lessons can be learned. The other thing we noticed, and this was quite impressive, how quickly they reorganized once they decided, okay, it's WHO has said it's going to be a pandemic. Okay, let's reorganize the company. And reorganizing the company is partly because employees may get sick or even die. So how should the organization look like in a pandemic? uh, this is like any large company, large bureaucratic organization, but for pandemic, they created teams, which was already part of the pandemic plan. So having a response team of senior management, including the CEO, and then a tier below, which was, uh, and this is at headquarters, a tier below would be people from marketing, people from supply chain, people from manufacturing, and so on. All of them, all the, in a way, the senior mid manager, senior middle level managers, all in one team, which would be the response team. And then they be able to revise the site preparedness plans and create a roles and responsibilities charts, but without names, because the names might change as the pandemic flows. People might get sick or die. And so you don't want to send email to person X, you want to send email to head of or committee member of such and such. So this kind of reorganization, and that kind of reorganization meant uh, internal communications have to change as well. Initially, for a month or so, they went through a very awkward time because people are used to communicating with their boss and so on, or receiving orders from one person. But now, because it's the world has changed somewhat, and you are in committees and so on, so people are getting orders from their boss, they're getting orders from the different committees, they're getting requests from the sites. So after a while, they had to change the communication patterns, but they were able to do it fairly quickly. And also the top-down communication, even from the CEO downwards, were fairly regular. So that way, employees knew what was going on. I work for a university, so I have no idea what's going on. Once in a while, we are told just to say that nothing's been decided, which is not, not very satisfactory, but that's the level of uncertainties we have. Okay. The third one is communicating with stakeholders. And first of all, you need to recognize who these external stakeholders are. WHO was clearly one in this case. And then the press too, because the press is sending out headlines saying thousands expected to die in England. And then you need to, press will ask you questions. Where is your antiviral? How well it's how much production do you have? How much have you provided it to England or whichever country the press reporter is from? And also be in constant touch with industry experts, with medical people. I mean, I see that in the UK now, many senior researchers from universities are advising the government um, with COVID-19. Anyway, so communication with external, communication means both ways. You learn and you also give out information. And one important stakeholders is different countries' governments. This is a global pharmaceutical company. And how do you allocate? You've seen that with COVID-19, how uh, like yesterday, the Sanofi, the French company, got in trouble because they publicly promised they would send so much vaccine to the US because of Trump. So, but then obviously the French government and the French people don't like it because here's a French company promising all of the vaccine to go to the US. And same thing in India, there was this HOCL. And the Indian government said, well, we are going to sell it, we are going to keep it inside the country. And then Trump calls up Modi and says, no, no, you've got to send it to us. And he says it publicly. And then the next day, the Indian government says, yes, yes, we will send it outside. So these kind of things go on. But in this case, company was able to make a schedule saying who would get and why they would get. So countries were ranked 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And if you were at a low priority, you would get nothing initially. But if you were very high priority, then you would get your order filled. And the priority was based on how many, so the highest priority would be a country where a number of people had actually died because it was higher there. And it didn't matter that it was a rich country or a poor country. It was based solely on this, and this was published information. So they could do allocation in one of the countries, I don't remember which, but a richer country. Uh, they asked the vice president to send them stuff, and then the vice president in turn asked his colleagues, can we send them this much? And they refused. So if you make rules and everybody can follow them, then allocation becomes much simpler. And then the fourth one is building and drawing on resources. It's fairly a big category. And this was quite useful for them. Something maybe 2 years or 3 years before the pandemic, the company had about 1.5 million, 1.5 billion with a B, US dollars on making their production capacity flexible. So that meant that you could use the same in pharmaceutical. That is actually very difficult. Usually capacities indicated in chemical industry in general. So in this case, they had invested in flexible equipment. So they had asthma lines, and those asthma lines, they were able to convert to making antiviral. So that flexibility is what helped them build the capacity. Even though during the flu, the number of asthma cases also increases. So asthma demand would also go up, but they were able to add shifts focused asthma production. They had inventory for asthma doses, so they were able to keep asthma going while taking off asthma lines and creating capacity for the antiviral. Secondly, we observed that employees could be flexible. So these were, remember, they had laid off the people who had been working on antivirals. So now they didn't have people, but what they had was the asthma, the more senior of the asthma people they brought in on the antiviral lines, and also added temporary employees to work under those more senior people or more experienced people. Of course, moving to 24/7 shifts and the word lockdown here meant quite different than what we have here today. But lockdown means basically requiring managers not to leave the country where they work. So that way, employees are available. And the restrictions to travel were simply because so that they wouldn't contract the disease somewhere. And then redesigning for manufacturing, you may have heard of different stories for different products, but in this case, they knew they weren't going to be able to manufacture enough of the delivery, which was a pump for the antiviral with multiple doses. They knew they couldn't possibly manufacture enough of those. And they didn't want to outsource it to China because it would get copied and it was their intellectual property. But what they did have was a single-use pump. And that technology was quite simple. So they got together with some Chinese manufacturers and made that, adapted that single-use pump for this particular virus. So that was the redesigning for manufacturing. And that really covers the situation of being able to add manufacturers. So they were able to get these Chinese manufacturers to produce those products. And then finally, postponement of market specificity. With any medicine, the box has to say which country and follow that country's rules. But given their situation, the orders would change. Some country would order something and then drop the order, or they would order more and they didn't have enough in production or have nothing in production, but they would have Greek labeled stuff and the Japanese were looking for it. So they decided to make generic product, meaning the product would not be for the Greek market or the Japanese market, but it would be generic. So initially governments accepted that. So in the weeks, the generic production, and then they would add a label in it with all kinds of languages. So you would have a very thick chart, but at least the box and all that would be quite generic. So these are the kind of resources. So, so they did meet the demand, as I mentioned before, and they were able to increase capacity from 0 to 60 million and then to 90 million by the time the autumn came, so before the second peak. And then for the following year, they were able to increase the capacity to 190 million doses. So that's quite a big and a quick increase. And remember, this capacity would be flexible, so it's not wasted capacity because the same capacity could be used for other things. And they made more revenues than before. They got the reputation. And I mentioned earlier that their flu vaccine, their flu antiviral was better than the competitors. And certainly they are well prepared for future pandemics. So let me conclude and say the research question was, what are the antecedents of super-adaptability? And we found these four: being prepared, being able to reorganize, being able to manage different types of stakeholders, being able to use and build resources. And resources are fairly, like I said, still have to figure out how to do it as resources, as in resource-based view, and capabilities as in dynamic capabilities, be able to tie it back to the theoretical lens we had used. And then practical implications are companies today, whether they are Indian companies or Irish companies or UK or English companies and so on, everywhere in the world they have to build those kind of capabilities. There's simply no way out. Okay, I'll stop here, and Chitresh, if you could, if you have questions.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Sodhi. That was a pretty wrapped up presentation in half slides to look at. Okay, there is one question by Professor Umar. So what I will do is that I will unmute her so that she can ask the question directly to you. Uh, yes, Professor Meenakshi, you can ask the question which you wanted to.
Thank you so much, Professor Chitresh, for providing us this opportunity. Thank you so much, Professor Sodhi. It was really very enlightening to hear your thoughts on this. I have a comment and a question. My first comment is that in India, Lifebuoy was one company precisely a month before who started off putting a press ad for all the citizens of a country to not be dependent only on a particular brand when it comes to hand sanitizers and soaps. I think that was something courageous that a company will do, especially when it is marketing its brand. So I could see that it was about an industry coming together to fight the pandemic at a global level. That was something that we noticed here unusually. My question to you is, can we also include being able to adding resources from related manufacturing industries under the heading of building resources? So
Yeah.
yeah.
Go ahead.
So over here, for example, automobile companies have taken up the projects of manufacturing ventilators. And now this especially holds true when we don't want to depend on other countries to supply us with anything.
Yeah. Yeah, that would be another resource. So I only talked about the supplier network, but in the extended network, you can include competitors as well as people from other industries. In the UK too, different auto companies got together to make ventilators, and knowing fully that they will not be making ventilators for very long. So that is an adaptability, although it's not always tied to the core product.
Thank you, sir. That answers my question.
Thank you.
Yeah, Professor Sori, I have a question. Mostly it's related to the one case study which you have presented. Like when they run their models. Okay, so what essentially they do is that every July they are running a pandemic model, that what happens when the supply chain is disrupted. So, and right now we
But
are looking at,
the question they're asking is, they're twofold. One is what kind of, it's not they're running what's the likely scenario this year. They have prepared scenarios for kinds of pandemics possible,
okay, yeah,
because they
so
don't know what might come through.
yeah,
But so you have to be prepared for
so
maybe.
essentially what we are basically talking here is that what is the R naught, the technical terms
Yeah,
which they use these days in pandemic discussion. Now everyone knows what is the R naught for it, and what is the time period between pandemic being declared at what
yeah.
stage. Okay, now based on your research for the H1N1 as against this COVID-19, what are the differences, stark differences in the pandemic itself, the declaration, and finally the company's response? So if you can contrast and compare the differences, that will be
Okay.
a good understand.
At that time, I had zero interest in pandemic, so I never found out much about the pandemic itself. But H1N1 is quite the opposite of COVID-19 in the sense it was killing young people. If you know from the Spanish flu, That was the characteristics of the Spanish flu in 1918 as well. It was killing not older people, but killing young people. So that's why also it was scary, although COVID-19 is quite the if you look at the profiles of who were getting more affected or death tolls, they would be quite complementary to each other. Although it wasn't as, it didn't spread doubling every 7 days as opposed to COVID-19 doubling every 3.5 days for most countries. So that was one. Your second part, Chitresh? So one was the difference between, oh, the companies, no, second was what?
The
One was
company's, sorry, just let me,
company's response.
Company's response to H1N1 as compared to what the company now, like
Yeah.
how they are
The
responding
company's
to it.
response there, I mean, like I said, there were 3 companies in the world which had antiviral, and they could look at the older vaccines. So that's what the medicines already existed and were approved. The vaccines already existed and were approved. So within 3-4 months, the vaccine was out, and the medicine technically was out on day 1 because it already existed. Whereas now we, in a way, the companies are, remdesivir is a failed antiviral from Ebola, which Gilead is trying to sell, and there's, it doesn't decrease the death toll at all, but somehow that's considered a miracle medicine, and HOCL has been discussed in India. So these are existing medicines. They haven't really been, maybe Gilead has been approved, but some of the other ones haven't been approved. So basically there's a lot of chaos, and because companies don't have anything in particular, they are just trying to recycle old medicines. I mean, the response looks much more chaotic because whatever it is, the tests haven't been, tests are still being carried out, whereas that was unnecessary in the previous case. And what was the third one, Chitresh?
No, these were the 2 questions itself. Anyone wants to ask any question can directly, you can provide the information that they want to have a conversation, and we can just unmute them through the chat window, basically. Anyone having any other question?
Yeah, Chitresh, why don't we unmute the entire group of audiences, and then if anyone has a question, they can ask Dr. Sodhi.
Okay, sure. So let me unmute everyone. If anyone has any question, they can ask straight.
Okay, there are too much background noise coming in.
Hello.
Yeah.
Yes, anyone has any question? Okay, then we will stop here. Thanks a lot, Professor Sodhi, for taking out time from your busy schedule and giving us a presentation. In case anyone wants to ask question to Professor Sodhi, they can. He is available, and you can write to him directly, and he is very much responsive on the mail as well on the chat. I will close the session here, webinar, and thank you for being here. Okay. All the best,
Yeah.
and be safe.
Thank you. So thank you so much, Dr. Sodhi, for taking the time of your busy schedule and talking to us. It was a pleasure to host you, and I'm sure Chitresh and the rest of the group will agree with me that we really learned a lot in the last 45 minutes or so.
Okay. Well, thank you for inviting me and giving this opportunity.
Yeah, and probably we will invite you again. And we won't take no for an answer.
That would be my honor.
No, the pleasure and honor are all ours. And trust me, it comes from the bottom of my heart.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone, for being here. Be safe. Okay, thank you.
Bye.